a pleasure to be here. So the game plan is for me to talk for about 25 or 30 minutes, maybe a little more, maybe a little bit less, then just open up to have a conversation. And I think that's, I welcome the conversation. So what my idea was to chat a little bit about some of the drivers of the present mess, some of what is going on right now, and what some of the big macro questions that have sort of emerged out of that, and then to get it down to some of the things that we as citizens and as philanthropists and as people in the public sector, people that run arts organizations or as artists care about and think about. The emphasis I want to make is the importance of we as citizens being pretty informed about this and understanding that these issues are issues that we deserve to have a voice about. Americans have curiously, in the last 50 years in particular, but I'd say, in fact, in large part in the last century, have clearly let go of what Bill Grider once called the money question, right? If you think about American history throughout the 19th century, you know, if you ever read about the populists, Larry Goodwin's great book, The Populist Moment, you know, it was all about the distribution of credit. It was about, you know, wild speeches about the gold standard and the silver standard. And you think about the first couple decades of the 20th century, and that was true also. At a certain point after the 1950s, but particularly from the 1970s onward, we've really sort of abdicated some of that responsibility as citizens, as it's become kind of a technical domain that we leave to experts. And technical domain that we leave to experts sometimes is okay and sometimes can be quite problematic, particularly when it defies common sense and logic. So I want to sort of emphasize the importance of our engagement as citizens in this. I'm speaking here today as Jeremy Nowak. I speak here today as the Reinvestment Fund. I'm certainly not speaking here, they'd be rolling over right now if I was speaking here as the Federal Reserve or the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. Although I have to say, when I first got there in January, they every once in a while would look at me at meetings like, who let the Visigoths into the doors of Rome? And since then, I've become sort of like one of the guys, you know, and I mean the guys, and particularly because I had a view in January that was much closer to where we are right now. So now every once in a while, somebody says, what do you think is going to happen next, Nowak? So it's become quite curious. All right, anyway, so just some of the fundamentals, a little bit that we know about, and some that maybe you don't. So we had over, you know, a long period of time, 6, 7 years, this extraordinary housing bubble. And that housing bubble, many of us benefited from, many of us didn't benefit from. It was driven by what economists call liquidity. There was an incredible amount of money out there. There's an incredible amount of money out there because the Federal Reserve had really low interest rates. Incredible amount of money out there because developing countries had savings. India, China, those economies were emerging. So you had low interest rates also. You had demography in the U.S. growing, one of the countries in the developed world that is still, you know, grows demographically in large part because of immigration. You have this sort of surge of housing values. And the surge of housing values was accompanied by something else, and it helped both facilitate it, but was also its accompaniment. And that was this extraordinary amount of innovation in the financial services sector, right? If I'm losing any of you, just, you know, take for. So when I mean innovation, I mean both by product. All of a sudden, people who, you know, could never get mortgages or could never get debt, they may have paid a lot more than they wanted to. All of a sudden, those people could get debt, could get mortgages, and you could do it really quickly, and all of a sudden you were being loaned to by institutions that you really never knew existed anymore. The old world of banking had changed really dramatically over 20 or 30 years, and you had this innovation by product and innovation by institution. What Nouriel Roubini refers to as the shadow banking system, the sort of $10 trillion shadow banking system of mortgage companies, of all kinds of other institutions, you know, hedge funds, emerged over a period of time. It was not your grandfather's Buick anymore. This was a fundamentally different kind of system, in part driven by deregulation, in part driven by technology, in part driven by globalization. But there was a really keen connection between a household in central Harlem and North Philadelphia or rural Nebraska and Wall Street. It was a connection that in some ways no one really understood how keenly connected they were. And at the same time that this happened, you had this emergence, if you remember, as part of this, of subprime lending, particularly but not exclusively, in the mortgage market. So subprime lending in the early 90s was a relatively small part of the mortgage industry. It grows rapidly, particularly when you can now bundle them together, sell those, you know, securities out in the mortgage market, and get rid of those mortgages. You don't hold them anymore. You get investors that buy them. So you have this emergence of subprime lending. Small piece of the mortgage market in the 90s grows ever more significantly, and then over the last couple of years, I mean, becomes a huge part of the mortgage market. And people are warning, if you read Ned Gramlich, who was a terrific guy who died unfortunately a few years back, wrote one of the great books on subprime lending. He was a Fed Reserve governor, and and if you read Ned's work, Ned was warning Alan Greenspan and others that something was going on here. We better pay more attention to it than maybe we're paying. It may have some hazard to it, right? Now, if my organization, among the things it does a lot of policy work. So we would be doing this analysis, going back 10 years ago, we'd be looking at the rise of subprime lending. We were looking at all this explosion of foreclosures, even way before you have these adjustable rate mortgages. And we're seeing all this, and we're wondering, and we're seeing all these people that are getting loans that, quite frankly, the housing values don't justify, and neither do their incomes. And often they don't understand the terms, and certainly don't understand the consequences of those loans. And to some extent, you didn't simply have a subprime mortgage market, but you had a subprime financial system. You had an extraordinary amount of, car title loans, of, payday lending. I mean, just this explosion everywhere, I mean, everywhere you would go. I remember recently last year I was in Phoenix. I don't know if anybody here's from Phoenix. I love the place, but every place I would go, I would see another sign for another funny lending operation. You'd go by the little strip mall, and along with the drugstore, it was the lending operation that took your car title and just sort of moved it. And those little places that looked like sort of marginal parts of the financial system, all of a sudden they're not so marginal parts of the financial system because they're keyed in to Wall Street securities, right? That's where they're getting, as economists would say again, their liquidity. I'm not trying to make this too complicated, but you have this transformation of the financial system, and the transformation is extraordinary. And that transformation is something where, when a market is strong, when a market is hot, people that are in markets function a little bit like lemmings, right? You just keep going over. When it's good, it'll never get bad. I mean, this is the psychology. And by the way, now that it's bad, it'll never get good, right? I mean, this is the problem, right? And this is just sort of human, and this is the problem. But at a certain point, you've got this misalignment of incentives, and you've got a very, very disaggregated system. And this is what I mean by that. And then I'll sort of just get off this point. But in this system, you've got a broker, somebody that finds, the loan for Mrs. Jones, and then they go to the investor, the lender, and then they make the loan. And then separately, you've got the appraiser who comes up with the value of the house, and then separately, you've got the securitizer who puts together a bundle of mortgages and sells it, and then you got the rating agency who figures out how it's going to be rated, so that prices it, and then you got the insurer for the pool, and their incentives are all in some ways, and I'm not saying in any way that there was some corruption, but for the most part, this was about just the misalignment of incentives. Everybody's got a hot market, everybody's making money on this flow of debt. This extraordinary flow of debt is happening in every household. And one of the results of that, there's several results to that, but one of the extraordinary results to that is the amount of leverage, the amount of debt in American institutions and in American households skyrockets over a 20 or 30 year period. Absolutely skyrockets. If you measure it against, Martin Wolf recently in the Financial Times had a really nice little article where he looked at the amount of debt in households over 20 years and how that has increased as a percentage of gross domestic product, or same thing with financial institutions, right? All of a sudden, you have this extraordinary amount of leverage, and it's risky.